Good evening, everybody. We have a clock up there that's a few minutes, so it's actually about 7. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. Yes, you would have a seat at this table. And either of these tables, if you would have a seat, that would be great. Thank you. And tonight's workshop, writing the long paper, which some of you may be getting ready to do or be in the midst of doing. And I want to encourage you as you're working on your papers to come to the Writing Center. There are yellow sheets on the tables which have Writing Center information, our contact information, our hours, answers to commonly asked questions about the Writing Center, and on the back side, how to schedule an appointment online, which is not that hard, and it makes it seem more complicated than it actually is. So if you go to the website, Writing Center website, and click on the schedule appointment button, you'll probably figure it out on your own. But we can also help you schedule an appointment. The lavender, purplish sheet, we are now on the back side of this sheet. After this week's workshop, we will have writing about poetry when we return from spring break on March 14th. And so for those of you who might be also getting ready to write about poetry or in the process of that, or just want to know about that topic, I would encourage you to come. There's some other interesting ones coming up, such as one on flash fiction, Chicago documentation. You might be doing that, and if you're in certain fine arts classes or history classes. Understanding using social media, a really good hot topic. Encourage you to come to that workshop if you can. And some others there that might be of interest to you as well. At the very end, we'll have the write-in, which will be a lot of fun, and we'll have food and drink for the write-in. You can drop in anytime from 7 to 11 that night and get help with the paper. And you can also work on your own writing while you're in here. So for tonight's workshop, if you want to get PAW points, I know some of you will know what that means, just write your ID number on the front of the comment card that will be distributed to you. And if you want an instructor notified that you were here, write the instructor name on the comment card. And for those at a distance, we'll be providing you with a survey link. So Dr. Benjamin Hagan has graciously volunteered to lead this workshop for us. And so I would hope that you would give him your complete attention. This will be useful. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm just going to launch into it because there's a lot of content here, some of which I may go through more quickly than other parts, but before I get to any of that, though, I'd like all of you to reflect a little bit on 3 questions for me. I have a sense some of you may be coming from the same class, so these questions, your answers may be the same, but it will be useful for me and for, I think, all of us if we get a sense of this. So think to yourself, what kind of long paper do you have to write this semester? In other words, why are you here? Other than extra credit, like, why are you here? What assignment do you actually have to complete? The second thing is, how long is long, right? Because when I was an undergraduate, I thought 4 pages was a long paper until I got to be a graduate student and was told that I had to write an 80-page thesis. Things change, so it could be good to know how long is long. But also, what do you want to know about completing your assignment and composing a lengthy document? What questions do you have? So it looks like most people have paper in front of them or a computer. So if you just take a few minutes and write down your answers to these questions, that would be helpful. Then we'll chat about them. So since these aren't very hard questions, I'll only give you another minute or so. At least I assume they're not very hard. Maybe they're hard. Good to see some people are just starting, but now that they're starting, we can actually chat about the people who wrote things down. What kind of long paper are people writing? I believe if they're going to speak out loud, should they use the microphone in front of them, Michelle?
Yes, please, and I always forget to say that.
Is there a button they push? They push
Yeah.
push, I believe.
You hold down the button. Hold down the button on the mic in front of you, and it will sound like this.
Okay, so I would just like, let's start at this table, the less populated table. There are two microphones. Is that a microphone
Yes.
over there? Yeah, so the gentleman in the back, perhaps. You can also just speak loudly if you want. It's up to you.
It'll be better if they mic,
Okay.
then the distance
Just-
people will hear them.
Yeah. What kind of paper are you writing? Yeah.
I'm currently writing a research paper, which is using different research, scholarly journals,
Okay.
articles.
For what class?
English 101.
Okay, thank you, thank you. All right, next you pass it down to the one next to you.
A research paper?
In what class?
English 205.
205, that sounds right, okay. Next.
Research paper?
In what class? You might sense a pattern. I'm going to wonder what class, right?
Just honors classes.
Honors classes, okay.
I'm also writing a research paper in Comp 2.
Com 2, okay.
A research paper in history of modern Russia.
Okay. All right, let's bounce to the table that's very prepared. The gentleman in the far corner, thank you. You look prepped and ready. Yes, go.
I am. We are doing a synthesis analysis in English 101.
Okay. How many people at that table are doing that assignment? All of you?
Except for
How about the people who did not raise their hand? What are you writing?
Literary analysis.
A literary analysis, and you're in the same boat, everybody else? Okay, all right, that's useful, that's good to know. So pretty much everybody is writing a paper that will involve some sort of analysis. Am I right about that? An interpretation of text of some sort, whether it's a history paper or a literature paper? Okay. I'm not going to have everybody go around and say how long the papers are, but I'm going to just simply say, how many of you are writing papers that are 10 pages long or longer? People are writing papers that are fewer than 10 pages long.
it's fewer than 10.
It's fewer, thank you. At least I have one person participating at that table. I appreciate that. Thank you. So what do you want to know about? What do you want to know? I'll start at this table that's very eager to talk. What would you like to know about? And if we could pass the microphone around, that would be useful. You don't have any questions. It's good that you're here then. Up at this table, does anybody here have a question? Something they want to know?
Oh, first time writing a research based argument, and what I would like to know is like elements that must be included.
Right.
What can be successful.
Good, that's great. I see nods from a lot of other people. Is that basically the gist of what you want to know as well? Anybody have something different than that?
Maybe like the work that should be done before actually starting to write your paper.
Okay, okay, very nice. One more.
Strategies for writing a paper.
Okay, strategies for writing paper. Does that satisfy the people at the table? Yes. Could you use the microphone?
So media analysis.
Media analysis?
Yeah, so my problem is I usually have a point, then according to my teacher's judgment, they're long, and I'm saying the same thing, I don't know, again and again and again. You know, she just gives me one big underline for like 100 and something pages. So like, how do you get a point, and like, how do you use one point to make more sense? Because if you're doing something with not so much points and she just tells you to write 1,200 words, you're gonna have to write something at least. So how do you do that?
Let's see if we can help out. We'll try. Okay. I don't think we'll all come out of here knowing exactly how to handle all these, but maybe a clearer sense of that. Good questions. All right, I'm going to pass by these two because they're pretty much the discussion we just had. Okay, these are the issues I'm prepared to address today. From generating topics to arguing to planning to drafting and revising. I'm not sure we'll have time to get all of these because it's a lot of content. But before I get there, I do want to just point out that the source I'll be using today is a classic textbook called The Craft of Research. We won't be talking about research today, but more the craft part of it. This is a rather inexpensive textbook, so I would recommend, even if you don't plan on, you might not ever use it in the class again, but if you do have to write a paper again, it might be useful to get this. I think it is, unlike, you know, a business writing textbook, it is quite inexpensive. All right, so generating topics. So we already talked about what classes you're all in and what sort of papers you may be writing. But I think before we even get to a question like, how do I analyze something? The first thing we should always be asking ourselves is, what interests me? This is actually an incredibly answer, especially if you're in a class that is not your major or a class that's focusing on a topic that you don't seem drawn in by. But part of being a good student is learning to see something and find something you're interested in. Because otherwise, the entire writing process itself is going to be much more grueling than it otherwise would be. I don't know if you all have had the experience of writing about things that bore you. Probably not. I'm sure that has never happened to you. But it's happened to me, and it's dreadful. So making the process as pleasurable as possible, it's usually good to write about something you care about. Also, when generating a topic, moving from interest to topic, a nice rule of thumb is that if you can sum up a topic or idea in 5 or 4 words, then chances are it's a little too broad. So say I'm in a class where I'm reading a novel by Leo Tolstoy, who's a Russian novelist. If I say that my interest or my topic is simply free will in Tolstoy, that's a little too broad, And after maybe some brainstorming or free writing, I might get to the point where I think to myself, actually what I'm interested in is the conflict of free will and inevitability in Tolstoy's description of 3 battles in War and Peace. How many have heard, I'm not going to ask who's read it, but how many have heard of War and Peace before? All of you. Just kidding, someone who's listening in, 3 hands went up. But War and Peace is a novel that's about 1,000 pages long, right? And so you can't write even a 10-page paper about this novel. So focusing in on 3 specific moments within it, and not just 3 specific moments, but a particular conflict between 2 ideas leads you into a better direction. After all, if you pay attention to the words that are included in that topic as opposed to simply the interest, you'll see that they can lead you to actually developing a claim. So if I say that my topic is free will in Tolstoy, that basically leads me to a claim that's either a yes or no question. There is or there is not free will in Tolstoy, which is a kind of boring argument. But if you look at the bullet point number 3, you'll see that the initial topic that is a little more elaborated leads nicely into the claim. In War and Peace, Tolstoy describes 3 battles in which free will and inevitability conflict. That sounds like a thesis statement. Should I move on? Are there questions about any of this? So in other words, if your topic if your topic leads you to a statement that's pretty much a yes or a no answer to a question, that's a little too broad. You need to narrow it in. You need to develop it a little bit more so that it's specific. Gives you a nice grounding to move on from. Okay. All right, so arguing. Relevant questions about argumentation. Okay, this may actually come, the question about media analysis and saying the same thing over and over again. Thinking about and breaking down what you're actually doing into these different questions might actually help a little bit. So asking yourself, what is my claim? What am I saying that someone might disagree? Because if you're not saying anything someone might not disagree with, you're not really saying anything. Right? You're not arguing anything. Then what reasons support your claim? What evidence supports your reasons? Do you acknowledge alternatives or complications or objections? Right? Do you anticipate other people who might step in and disagree with you? Or those of you who are reading articles downloaded from databases, do you find critics or other scholars that disagree with each other or with you? I'm not going to spend very much time on this last point. It's a little more of a complicated rhetorical term. But you might also consider what sort of ground, what sort of warrant you have for even claiming that your reasons are valid. Right? Questions about any of these terms? Okay, I'm going to move on. I can always come back to it afterwards, too. So one mantra I often run my writing students through, again and again and again, whether in office hours or in the classroom. We all chant it. It's very creepy. We all chant it together. We don't kill anything, don't worry. Claim because of reason based on evidence. What are you arguing? And what is your reason? And why should I believe you? Right? This is true whether you're arguing within a literary analysis about what you think a poem means, what you think a story means, what you think and why you think a particular ad in a newspaper is problematic, what you think a particular event in Russian history, why it may be significant, right? You need these component parts in order to craft a persuasive paragraph, essay, paper. Okay. Should we chant it together, or is that a little too creepy? On the count of 5. On the count of 3? No. Yes. On the count. I'll count to 3. On 3, we'll do it. How's that? Is that okay? So 1, 2, 3. Claim there's a reason based on evidence. One more time. Claim because of reason based on evidence. I want you to have trouble falling asleep tonight because that's running through your mind. Right, I want it written on the back of your eyelids as you think about how do I plan what I'm doing. I don't really want that. I do want you to be well rested so you can actually read the paper. I'm just kidding. All right. So this isn't maybe the best example of a paragraph, but I think it does sort of help break down. Can people see the fine print on there? Little labels for all the sentences that might be a little hard to see. So I'm going to read this paragraph and I'll read the labels too, just so it's a little clearer. So this is taken from, I don't know if it's a fictional paper about television violence or a real one. It doesn't really matter, but it's an example. So here are a few sentences. TV violence can have harmful psychological effects on children. That sounds like a claim. Claim number 1, right? That's something someone could disagree with, whether or not they have good reasons, that doesn't matter. You can envision someone disagreeing, okay? So that sounds like a claim. I'm gonna start over. TV violence can have harmful psychological effects on children because those exposed to lots of it tend to adopt the values of what they see. The little label there says reason 1 supporting claim 1, but also the writer has cleverly worked in a second claim at the end of that sentence. The paragraph begins, the children's constant exposure to violent images makes them unable to distinguish fantasy from reality. So now we have a second reason supporting the first reason and also the second claim. Smith, 1997. What's that? Smith, 1997. What's that? It's a reference to an outside source, presumably somebody named Smith who wrote something in 1997. right? Smith found that children ages 5 to 7 who watched more than 3 hours of violent television a day were 25% more likely to say that most of what they saw on television was really happening. This is not just a reason, this is now evidence as well, right? Something that a scholar, someone who has some kind of clout, presumably within the discourse of television violence, what they think and what they say. This is evidence supporting the second reason. And then we get bolded sentences, so these are probably important. Of course, some children who watch more violent entertainment might already be attracted to violence. This is labeled acknowledgement. What do you think that means? What do you think?
He's acknowledging the other side of the
Acknowledging not necessarily the other side, but a potential counter, right? Someone might say, well, maybe those kids already were violent anyway, right? And so they're saying, of course, there may be cases in which, right? So this is also known as qualification, right? Look, I will acknowledge that there might be someone who could say this, but I'm still right, in other words, right? Next sentence, but Jones, 1999, found that children with no predisposition to violence were as attracted to violent images as those with a violent history. This is labeled response, right? So if you acknowledge the argument of another or anticipate it, you follow it up with a nice sentence that says why you're still right. Does that make sense? To the gentleman that's mentioned media analysis, do you see how each of these sentences do something a little different? You see how each of these sentences do something a little different, right? They're saying something different. They're all about the same thing. They're all about the same claim. But, yeah. All right. So getting to the question of planning, how do we get to this paragraph, right? How do we work our way here? I think it's important when doing your research, when reading the arguments of others, when reading your poems or stories or historical documents or whatever you're arguing about over and over and over again, that you think about the order that your reasons and evidence need to go in. So ordered reasons and evidence outline the logical structure of the paper. So whatever order in which your reasons and evidence show up, that helps your reader follow a particular logic. And they might finish the paper agreeing with you or not agreeing with you. In some sense, it doesn't matter as long as they can follow the logic. So if that's a preliminary outline of your paper, it might be nothing more than an organized map, not just of points you want to make, but your primary claim, your reasons for believing your primary claim, and the evidence you've compiled for supporting your reasons, and thus the primary claim. So I'm going to go back just a second. In other words, your outline should be including these things. So not just A, introduction, B, body, and then like 1, 2, 3, blah, 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 but then like adding these other things too. Like, what are your claims? What are the various things you're going to write about? What are your reasons? And what evidence? And if you don't have evidence, there's your problem, right? You got to find some or articulate some. Right, this would be one way to sort of imagine it. It's not a great map for thinking about it, but instead of just having a basic intro, body paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you sort of bracket the whole thing with claims and also match up reasons and evidence together. All right, so developing this notion of planning a bit more. I often think about my outlining when even the things I write tend to be quite a bit longer than 5-page analyses or seminar papers. I still think of outlining as storyboarding as opposed to, so you know what I mean by, do people know what I mean by storyboarding? Like if you're a director of a television show, you have those boxes and you sketch out what every scene is going to be, right? If it helps you to think of outlining as storyboarding, I think I encourage you to sort of run with that. Often when I begin storyboarding an essay, I'll just sketch a working introduction. Why do you think I call it a working introduction? It's not because it's getting paid. Can you say it into the microphone? You don't have to if you don't. I don't really care. I'll just move on.
It's going to help with whatever is going to come after to like explain what you should expect or something.
Right, so it's doing work, right? It's doing work. Also because it's provisional, right? It can change, right? In other words, it's ongoing, it's working, it's setting up, but also you can go back and change it if you need to, right? So often I do this by beginning using a separate page in a Word file or in a notebook for each board of the story I want to tell. So at the top of my first page, I summarize the relevant points of my secondary sources or relevant points of a position I plan to complicate or oppose. I state my interest or topic as an objection to this summary. In other words, I cluster all the stuff that I found in my research as succinctly as I can at the top of the page. And then I try to say, again, as succinctly as I can, what do I think of this? What do I object to, right? What's my point? What do I want to argue? I then state the consequence of not attending to this topic. What's been lost by not paying attention to this? And then I follow that up with a tentative claim or thesis statement. Now, this paragraph is probably going to be incredibly ugly, right? It's not going to look good. And I think that's okay. That's one of the hardest things to sort of accept as a writer, is that the first time it comes out, it's going to look bad. And it's our job to do this early enough so we have time to go back and fix it. We'll get to revisions later. So for instance, this is a very rough instance of this. This is sort of laying out in a working fashion what an introduction might look like on this storyboard. Right? So say someone is writing about, you know, this stuff. Research reports A, B, and C suggest that firstborn middle-class native Caucasian males earn more, stay employed longer, and report more job satisfaction. So this is some sort of, people okay over here? Okay, that's good, thank you. So in other words, summary of the key sources would follow up on this point. The next part, but those reports tell us nothing about recent immigrants from Southeast Asia. So a question rephrased as a gap in the research. Until we see how these patterns occur in other cultures, we can't know whether the influence of birth order is cross-cultural. What are the consequences of ignoring this point? This is followed up by a tentative main point that could be a thesis statement of a larger paper. The predicted influence seems to cut across groups, though it partly depends on how long a family has been in the United States and their economic level before they arrived. In most cases, after you've sort of developed this introduction, this is when you want to think about the length of the project. If this is only a 5-page paper double-spaced, it might feel like that's a lot, but really, it's not. Once you've done enough research and have been thinking a lot about what you have to say or what you have to analyze or what you have to inform your reader of, the space gets taken up very quickly. If you're writing a 10-page, 15, 20-page paper, suddenly you have a little more room to move. Often I think of if a student is worried about writing, say, a 10-page paper, I often tell them, stop thinking about it as a 10-page paper and think of it as a paper with 12 paragraphs, 13 paragraphs, 14 paragraphs. And suddenly it becomes a much different project. You only have 14 boxes in which to sort of move and make your argument, right? Now, of course, this is a rough estimate. A 14-paragraph essay could just as easily be 15 pages, right? But planning for more paragraphs than pages is always a good rule of thumb. Does that make sense for everybody? Right? Thinking of it less in terms of pages or word count and more in terms of paragraphs you need to finish. How many terms will, if you are worried about what do you need to develop in terms of content, you might ask yourself, how many terms will I need to define? Those of you who may be needing to use philosophy or theory or defining terms that are specific to a historical time period, this will be an important question to consider. Also consider the purpose of the project and your audience. How much background should you give? For instance, if you're reading a story that your teacher has just taught to you, chances are they don't need a summary of the story, right? They are very familiar with the story. Or if you're writing for an audience that knows something about Russian history, you might think about, what do I need to put in here? Right? Is the paper long enough to warrant breaking it into several different sections? Often things I write, I break up into several different sections. I have a subtitle for each of those sections, right, that address subtopics and subclaims. Other things you might want to think about in the planning stages is what your organizational principle is. What is the logic around which you're ordering your paragraphs? Are you moving part by part? Is your topic broken up into pieces and you're just moving logically around. You're dealing with Russian history or dealing with literature or dealing with a story and you're analyzing parts of the story in chronological order. Is the organization of your paper chronological? Schemas should always be sensitive to the audience that you also have in mind, right? So if your audience is very familiar with a story, it's probably not wise to move chronologically through it because your reader will be sophisticated and able to follow an argument that moves in a much more subtle way. Stop me if there's questions. Other ways that you can think about organizing it is if you have a short point or a claim that you don't think will take very long to develop, you can move from the shorter, simpler claims to the longer and more complicated claims, moving in a nice gradual, straightforward way, not chronologically, but from, see how rhetorically this would work. You agree on really simple things, slowly moving up to a point where it's more complicated, right? And by the time you've gotten there, your reader will agree. General analysis to more specific application. If, for instance, you're writing about something that you think would be important or applicable to the contemporary world, for instance, it might be important to end by talking about that application to the contemporary world. Or if you're dealing with something that's incredibly controversial or contestable, another way to do that is to begin again with something that people can kind of agree on before you move to the really controversial points. Okay. Questions about that? Does that make sense? So when you're planning your papers, think about what order do your paragraphs go in. As I said before, it's important, at least for me, it might not be important for you, to use a separate page of your storyboard for each section. Sort of, instead of cramming it all together on one page that you get lost in this maze of thinking, actually trying to separate out page to page, again, either in a Word file or in an actual notebook, beginning each section, each paragraph. What goes here? What goes there? When I was in high school, we actually had to do this on note cards. Do people do that? You write a paper by like writing everything on note cards first. And so then when you actually went to compose the paper, you just had a stack of 300 note cards and you just one after another. By the time you got to the bottom of the stack, you had 20 pages, right? So do that too. That'll be one way to go. Under each section then, each board or page of your storyboard, include also relevant terms, key reasons and corresponding evidence, potential responses to your claims and reasons, counter arguments. What you're really doing here is not just boarding a story, not just outlining, but giving yourself a roadmap. One of the most frustrating parts of writing a long or creating a long project is getting lost, right? 7 pages into a 15-page essay, you suddenly wonder, where am I? What was I saying? And so if you have this design in mind, you'll always have a nice sort of map of a, do you guys know those maps in like malls that have the red dot that says you are here, right? That's what you're sort of creating for yourself, right? This sort of map of a mall. So you can, when you get lost, you can say, ah, this is where I am. And this is the order it goes in. Okay. So what sorts of sections could you think about? Sometimes, depending on the class or depending on the project, you might devote an entire section to reviewing the research that you did or reviewing the scholarship. For very long papers in a graduate seminar, for instance, you would want to detail what sort of debates do the scholars have about this, right? What does one television critic say to the other, right? Who do they cite? Who are they getting in fights with, right? Laying out this groundwork is important. If you're writing a historical paper, devoting maybe 1 or 2 sections to the historical background, especially if it's relevant or necessary or obscure. For instance, I'm writing about a novelist right now who none of you need to care about. But for instance, scholars have never really addressed the fact that when he published his first novel, he had been an elementary school teacher for 10 years. And then quit shortly after publishing his first novel. That seems a relevant context to think about, that this writer was a school teacher when he published his first book. Anyway. Riveting stuff, I know, but we'll get back to that. Specific moments or chapters or sections in a primary text, especially since a lot of you are in literature classes or in English classes. If you're analyzing a poem or a novel or a short story, one thing I often like to do is reverse engineer. I mean, this might not be necessarily great practice, but it's, if you're stuck, it's one way to sort of get things moving. Is before even coming up with an argument. I know I've been telling you come up with your argument first, but before even coming up with your argument, finding the pieces of evidence within a literary text. What are the parts that you're interested in? What do you want to write about? Pulling those out, getting them on a storyboard, and asking yourself what argument emerges from the relationship between this evidence. Or devoting an entire section to a single trend or pattern. This is especially appropriate for papers dealing with large data sets. And then, going back to the organizational principle, as you do this, remind yourself, is this a simpler section than the previous? Is it more complicated? Perhaps it should be moved. Perhaps it should go later, right? Drafting. So we're going to delve into inner, hidden, deeper secret ways, I'm just kidding, to write papers. It's mostly just grueling and awful and horrible to write things, right? I mean, it's so rewarding and amazing, but at the same time, really hard, right? So I'm not that old, but for over a decade now, I've tried over and over again to change how I write because I am horribly inefficient. I write things, when I'm writing or designing a project, I usually keep about 4 or 5 notebooks that I write them. I don't know why I do this, but I get bored of writing in one notebook, so I start writing in another one, and then another one, and then another one, and then I'll have 3 Word files that I'm taking notes in and drafting, and then I lose a notebook, but then I have to gather that all into one Word document, and then I start the process all over again. Anyway, it's horrible. I don't know why I do it this way, but I've tried to make it more efficient, and I've just given up. Right? This is how I write. This is my process. It's inefficient, it's messy, it's frustrating, but it's how I get things done. Right? So learning what your process is and to what degree you can control it, I think is really important, especially when thinking about how much time you need to finish the project that you have. Are you someone who drafts quickly? Right? Can you sit down and write 10 pages in one night, in one go? If you can, I envy you. But that also means that you need to do that early, not the day before it's due, but do it early so that you can go back and revise carefully. If you're like me, you draft slowly and you revise intermittently. And so your first finished draft is actually quite polished, right? The problem is it takes a long time. Also, there's a combination, right? Sometimes I go back and forth between being able to write things quickly and then having to go back and revise. And then other times it's brick by brick by brick, it falls down, I have to start over, right? So you have to learn what kind of writer you are and how much time you're going to need. Okay. Breaking up the drafting process into manageable tasks also helps. So saying to yourself, either in the morning when you wake up at 4 a.m. like I do, or before you go to bed, what I'm going to do today or tomorrow. Today I'm going to compose a working introduction, and being okay that that's what you're going to get done that day. Today I'm going to write 1 paragraph, but not just 1 paragraph, a specific paragraph. Which one are you going to write, right? Which paragraph on your roadmap are you going to attend to? And then today, if this is a day where I've gathered all that messy garbage into 1 Word document, maybe this is the day I go through that Word document and try to streamline it. Does this actually make any sense? Today I'm going to compose my counter argument to this or that possible response. Whatever task you give yourself, it's easier to think of the project as a series of tasks that if you've already storyboarded it. Instead of thinking, in other words, of the paper as 1 long thing that you write quickly, just 1 thing, but rather many things, a galaxy of things that need to get done and put in a specific order, maybe it becomes a little more manageable. Am I making sense? Am I speaking in Greek? No? Okay, good. In other words, you also might want to think about making a schedule for yourself. Some people are very good at writing a little bit every day or a lot every day. I've discovered I'm a little better at dedicating blocks of time during the week. So Thursdays from 1 to 5 I write, Saturdays from 1 to 5 I write, Mondays from 11 to 2 I write, and don't bother me during those times. That's when I do it, right? Figuring out what times and what blocks you're going to do that in might be important for you. And maybe also you might want to rotate between these two things. Are you better at working an hour every day? Or are you better at working for long chunks of time a few times a week? These are also moments where you can look back at rough notes that you've taken while reading. Did everybody else hear that? Okay, good. No?
Normal.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Someone trying to freak me out over there. Looking back at rough notes, sometimes ugly things that you weeks ago, you'll come back to them weeks later and realize, huh, that's not that bad, right? And so whatever sort of stuff you're gathering or writing, whether it's ideas on napkins or in notebooks or scribbling on pieces of paper while you're at a boring workshop like this, whatever you're doing, right? It's not, I'm kidding, this is really exciting. Whatever you're doing, it's also always useful to go back over and reflect on what were these scribblings? What was I doing? Because it might actually end up filling in a hole in your storyboard. Even getting sometimes one crucial sentence or idea on a page during a busy day can also prime you for a later day when you can devote more time to composing larger or longer sections. Sometimes my task for a day is to write a sentence that will set me up for the next day when I know I'll be less busy to really get going. Question or just looking at me? Yes, go for it. Push the button.
Okay, sorry, I wanted to ask this at the end, but like if you want to explain, I can still ask. So,
Please.
Advices on how to rough draft and all. You said some people go faster and some people go slower. Okay, but from all the explanations you've given me, I think this is more of a suggestion than a question, but would you agree with me if I say it's better when you list everything? Because in all the examples you've given us, you've always started with one sentence, you got it, and then you gather them up. I mean, I don't want to have 300 notes cards. It's not going to be funny.
No, you don't have to use the note cards.
Yeah, or
Certainly
having
not.
5 notebooks.
Yeah.
You understand? But why I might agree with that is because if we do it like how you're suggesting we should, and have each sentence or something every day, and then finally when we gather all this stuff, it should make sense. But question, what if we have limited time?
Yes.
So what happens then?
What happens then? Well, we all have limited time, don't we? Right. And so I think that's something to deal with early in a semester. Looking at the syllabi you've been given on the first day of a semester, what tasks do you have to do? You start all the way back on the very first day. What do I have to get done by the end of this semester? I often tell my students, a good rule of thumb is to know the syllabus better than your professor does.
You might also try this, like look at your final deadline for a paper and then just work backwards. Like figure out when do I need to have my earlier draft done, what am I going to need to do each day in order to get to that first deadline for that rough draft. How much am I going to have to do before that first deadline? And like, do I need to be working on this every day for a week in order to hit that first deadline? It's going to vary by person.
Yeah, person by person. I think especially when like in freshman workshops and stuff, the quick answer to this question is time management. Right? We all have limited time, right? All of us do. Whereas I tease my students, y'all have, like, you're doing nothing this weekend, right? So I'll just have you read another story. I'm usually just kidding when I do that, right? But yeah, I don't do that. I'm just kidding. But I think it's useful. Yeah, you need to know when these things are due, right? When do you need to get the parts of it done? And especially if you're in a class where you're actually turning in these early drafts before completing a finished draft, that's a good way to do it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
It does? Okay, good. It's not a great answer, I know, not very comforting, but all right. So I think I've been bouncing back and forth between what I do, which I am not advocating. I don't think it's a good idea to keep 5 notebooks, and right, I don't think it's a good idea. If it works for you, that's the sort of pit you've dug for yourself like I have. But I think it is important, though, to try not to obsess over perfection early on in the drafting process. Otherwise, you're writing your introductory paragraph for a week when you need to have a finished draft by the end of that week, right? So once you have an ugly looking beginning, move on, right? And as you can see at the bottom of this slide, I'm very bad at taking my own advice. So, have you heard of the cliche, do as I do, not as, or do as I say, not as I do, right? Yeah, so it's basically that, right? Well, I'm gonna skip over this. Oh no, I should probably do this, probably talk about this. When sort of going back, no, we'll come back to that, sorry. We'll go to that with revising. So next part, revising. So revising can be something that you do as you're drafting, right? But ideally, it's something you do when you come back to having nice big chunks done, right? Revising is not a matter of correcting errors, as you probably have teachers tell you, but of evaluating and re-seeing the whole project. This comes back to the problem of time. Do you have time to revise, right? Often we don't, right? So sometimes people work revision into the very process itself. Some strategies for revision is to read your document, if you have enough of it done, like a reader, right? Imagine yourself in the position of someone who has not written it, but someone who's just reading it, right? Also evaluate the frame of the report. Readers should be able to recognize when your intro begins, when your conclusion begins, and which sentences in one or both make your main point or give the takeaway, right? If you hand your paper to a friend and they have no idea what your paper's about, that's not a good sign, right? I think it's also important, coming back to the storyboarding issues, to identify as you go the link between the reasons you've come up with for your primary claim and the various sections. Is the organization of the paper in harmony with the logic of your argument? Ask yourself why a reader might reject your arguments. Is there something you've forgotten about? Also, sometimes this is called signposting. If you go through your document and you see that it isn't actually clear how you're transitioning from one point to the next, it's important to sort of think about how you will signal from one section to the next. Does each major section begin with words that signal how that section relates to this one or the one before it? So if you have a paragraph that begins, more important, you're signaling that you're about to bring up an issue or a claim that's even more important than the one you just went over, right? The other side of this issue is, some have objected that. One complication is, and then, although not recommended, first, second, third. Right? Also, do you have a vocabulary that runs through the paper, right? One telltale sign, I know we're not talking about plagiarism today, but one telltale sign of plagiarism for teachers is when the vocabulary of a paper shifts and changes. That suddenly the teacher who's very used to a certain student's way of writing, when they recognize that there's a shift, they say, that's strange. And they go and sort of look up or look at the Turnitin report. Anyway, we'll put aside that never happens, right? So we'll put aside that, and we'll simply say that one way to think about making sure that your argument is coherent is to show that there's a consistency of vocabulary and terminology throughout. Okay, this was the point I sort of skipped over at the end of the last section there. Also, when you're revising or proofreading your own paper, I think it's important to do a paragraph check. This is what I mean by a paragraph check, especially for those of you writing analytical or interpretive papers. Does each paragraph have an introductory topic sentence that makes a point or a claim? So for instance, if I'm reading a paper and the first sentence of a paragraph reads, and then Jane Eyre moved to Thornfield, where is it Thornfield? Yeah. To live with Mr. Rochester, right? This is from a novel called Jane Eyre. As a teacher, I would say, yes, she does do that, right? That is a fact of the novel, right? It's not a claim, right? So the paragraph is being set up to simply summarize things that happen, things that I already know about. You want your first sentences or your topic sentences to actually be making an argument about the significance of Jane's journey to Thornfield, if you're writing about Jane Eyre. Second thing, does each paragraph provide evidence and commentary that explains the relevance of this evidence and information? Does it, in other words, provide reasons and evidence and commentary? Do the sentences of each paragraph have a clear, there's a little typo there, sorry, a clear organizational principle, right? What's holding these sentences together, or do they just feel like they're repeating the same thing over and over and over again? If a paragraph is making a simple point, it's okay to keep it short and move on to a new paragraph. It doesn't have to be a page and a half long. All right. So I might go through the sample topic or storyboard, but are there other questions about things I've gone over, or something you want me to repeat? No? All right. I'm going to give you a sample topic and storyboard. This is an actual essay I worked on last spring and finished. I mean, it almost killed me, but I did it. I did manage to finish it. Okay. So forgive the topic. It is a little nerdy. It's what I research in my real life as a scholar, so you probably won't care about it. But, you know, this is just the way it goes. So ignore the content. Just pay attention to the form or structure if you want. So I was asked to write an essay for a collection on a book collection on a group of writers and essayists in early 20th century England known as the Bloomsbury Group. And I was asked to write an essay that explored connections between the Bloomsbury Group and the very broad word philosophy. This is what I was tasked to do. I had about 10,000 words in which to do that. That's about, I don't know, 25 pages, double-spaced. What is that, Michelle? Does that sound right? Yeah, okay, 25 pages double-spaced, let's say. 25, 30, something like that. Okay, so how I began approaching this enormous topic is I started just writing things, again, in 5 different notebooks and on napkins. What connections can I find between philosophy as a discipline, an academic discipline, and the Bloomsbury Group? And I immediately ran into a problem, that this was a group of artists and essayists and novelists. None of them were philosophers. So it felt a little strange. Why on earth was I even writing this essay in the first place, right? What connections could there possibly be? And then I realized, and I wasn't the only one to have realized this, that many of them had attended Cambridge University when they were young men. They were all men at the time. Women were not allowed to, or weren't allowed to take degrees at Cambridge at the time. And they were all members of this conversation society that was dedicated to philosophical inquiry, and so this was a place to begin. I also noticed that Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore were members of this society, and I don't know if any of you are philosophy majors, but these are two of the most important philosophers of the early part of the century. What were you saying over there?
We're working on our synthesis paper, so
You were pointing out the synthesizing going on? Yes, thank you. Yes. All right. Then I ran into another problem, that not all Bloomsburys, as members of this group, were called, not all of them attended Cambridge. So what is this, especially the women of the group? So what does this mean? Does this mean their work does not intersect with philosophy? My favorite writer, Virginia Woolf, for instance, uses the word philosophy over and over again in her novels, but she did not attend Cambridge University. So should she have a place in my essay or not? This was a problem I ran into. So other topics that came to mind, the influence of the two philosophers I mentioned on some of these people, but not on others. The philosophical threads in Bloomsbury's art, politics, economics, and friendships. The resonances and dissonances between Cambridge philosophy and Bloomsbury's who did not attend Cambridge. So I just started listing things, like what sort of things could I maybe build sections around. And I began building a storyboard. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I built up parts of an introductory section that would just sort of introduce some of the things I've just been talking about. I would follow this up by a section that would then intervene in this, asking certain questions about what have scholars dedicated to these writers forgotten about? What's wrong, or what's problematic with their approach to it? And the last problem you see under section 1, the last bullet point, why do we presume that Bloomsbury must have a coherent philosophy in the first place? Don't worry, I'm almost done. The second section, I would focus on the two philosophers I mentioned, G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell, sort of thinking about, when they think about the word philosophy, what do they actually mean? Right? So I read their lectures, I read their books, just thinking about not so much what their philosophy is, but when they say or ask the question, what is philosophy, what are they doing? The last section looked at 4 case studies, Lytton Strachey, who is a historian, John Maynard Keynes, who is an economist, probably the most famous economist in England in the 20th century, Vanessa Bell, who was actually a painter, and Virginia Woolf, who I mentioned earlier, who was a novelist, essayist, diarist, and biographer. The point of this section was to show how these writers, even if they weren't philosophers, nevertheless were doing something like philosophy in their work. Anyway, I came up with various takeaways. I was left with remaining questions, and so despite actually finishing this 10,000 word essay, I ended up developing more stuff that I could actually write about in a later thing if I had time or desire. One thing that was actually the case for me, time was actually a problem. The possibility under remaining questions is that I had to submit this paper long before it was perfect. I had to send it to the editors long before it was perfect. And part of the process there was that just like in your classes, when you turn in an early draft, I turned in a draft, had it returned to me, sent it back, it was returned to me, and eventually it became a book chapter.
With that back and forth, you were revising constantly based on their comments to you.
Yeah. So whether you're whether you're a professor, or whether you're a student in 210 or 201, it's never the case that the thing you submit is perfect the first time. Okay, that's all I got for you. Are there any questions? What did I not cover that you need answers to? And as you fill out the cards,
So I just, a lot of what he was talking about there, as you're working on your paper, think about those deadlines that are coming and, when you need to start your work for the paper. And you might only get your introductory paragraph written with your thesis, and you think, I want to try this out on somebody. Come to the Writing Center. We've got people who are just waiting to help you. They'll give you feedback on your thesis, your introductory paragraph, help you outline if you need to, talk about the synthesis. We know that's a difficult assignment, or any kind of writing that you're doing. Our people can help you. Some of them are working on the very same kinds of assignments that you are, whether it's an essay or perhaps an advanced piece of writing that you're doing, even a thesis. We can help you. And once you get to the stage where you've got a draft and you're in the revising stages, we can help you there as well. And we can also help you avoid, plagiarizing, show you how to cite properly, whether you're an APA or MLA or Chicago style, to help you be doing that. And you can have a frank conversation with your writing consultant, who is a fellow student, about what's going on in your paper, what your concerns are. So take advantage of that. Once you get your comment cards filled out, please give them to Rye, who handed them out to you. Again, if you want those paw points, be sure to write your ID number on the front of your comment card. Put your name down. Yeah, I can use it. Yep.
It's past nothing. What? Yeah, it's sort of. Yeah,
Really